All right, welcome back to the program. Let's get our conversation on the road now. Let's hit the ground running, just like we expect the ministers to hit the ground running. Dr. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist at PwC, is joining me via Skype from the Commercial Nerve Center, I suppose. Dr. Nevin, good day.
Good morning. Can you hear
Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing my best, thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, are you in Lagos? I suppose you're in Lagos.
I am in Lagos, yes.
Okay, welcome to the show. The president has invited 43 cabinet members to the table to eat lunch with him. As Nigerians, we are wondering what lunch would look like right now after the assignment of portfolios yesterday. Let me have your first-hand assessment of the portfolios. New ministries were created: Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs and Disaster Management. So power has been unbundled from works, power, and housing. You also have, about 5 ministries. What do you think?
Well, I think the unbundling of power makes sense. The ministry last time was too large with power, works, and housing all together. I think the creation of some new ministries, each one on their own, makes a lot of sense. But I think the overall, we all know in Nigeria we're challenged with governance because we have a minister of state and a minister for most of the ministries. So then we end up with too much bureaucracy. But certainly the humanitarian ministry makes sense given the situation Nigeria is in and the high number of IDPs that we have in the country and the situation in the Northeast, but not just there, but also in Cross River State where we have displaced people from Cameroon coming in as well. So, but again, the overall governance structure is, I think most Nigerians would agree, is too onerous.
Now, what do you think lunch would look like with the 43 ministers right now?
I'm sorry, Nancy?
Yes, I asked, what do you think the lunch would look like at the table, since the president has invited 43 people to the table to have lunch with him in the persons of the ministers? What should we begin to expect?
Well, I think to begin with, I mean, we have had a very positive developments in the sense that this administration is starting with what are the key issues, certainly the key economic issues. So the president has been very clear that the objective is to lift 100 million people out of poverty in 10 years. That was not said when the last administration started.
They say talk is cheap. And we've been having a lot of talk without commensurate action to back it. Taking a look at what you just said, which the president did mention in his speech, I think during June 12th, isn't it, to take 100 million people out of poverty in 10 years. The same government has come out to say that 5 million people have been taken out of poverty in the last 3 years. So was it 2 or 3 days ago I was reflecting and doing the calculation, if the government has taken 5 million people out of poverty in 3 years or so, how long will it take for the government, which is a continuum, to take 100 million people out of poverty in 10 years? That means perhaps we are already underperforming.
Well, I think also, I mean, Nigerians are skeptical of the 5 million number. And I think to be credible, the Nigerian government's going to have an external body decide, measure how many people are out of poverty. But we know that the economy has not been growing as fast as population. So it's hard to believe that we're actually reducing poverty when we have growth below population. I mean, to take 100 million people out of poverty, we would need to grow at least 6 to 8% over the next 10 years. The central bank governor has come out and said actually he believes, and he's going to support policies that aim for double-digit growth, so 10% plus. Now, you might think that's not achievable, but I think China achieved double-digit growth for at least 15 years of its economic miracle. So we need that level of economic growth to make a dent in poverty. And I think it highlights, I think what's really critical, though, which we have not heard the president say, which is that the only way to take 100 million people out of poverty is a much bigger private sector. So PwC has said for the last 2 or 3 years, the private sector needs to be 10 to 15 times bigger than it is today. We need to have that signal that says, because there aren't enough resources to create social programs with our existing budget revenue to lift people out of poverty. Only the private sector can do that.
Now, let's still stick with these ministers, the 43 of them. Do you see the country coming out of the quagmire which it is presently in? If you take a look at it, you've just spoken about economic miracle that China performed, double-digit growth, very true. Do you see that economic miracle coming out right now? Because we have a lot of economic challenges facing us. With these 43 people, are they the delivery men and women?
Well, I think that we've said before that there was a lot of effort, for example, PEBIC in the last administration, but the reason we were not growing faster was the country was not willing to take on some structural issues. Yesterday, there was chatter, certainly in the press, and we're trying to find out more about it, about the power ministry already coming out and saying, or NER coming out to say there's going to be a more cost-reflective tariff. So maybe a tariff. So maybe that's a step in the right direction. Sorry, let me just consult. The new power minister is.
We just have to get used to their names too.
So
Yes.
Minister Jetty Agba. So
Yeah.
I mean, if that is coming as the official thing that we're now going to have cost-reflective tariffs, that's a big structural change. It's come out on the first day of the new of the minister's name. Maybe that's a positive sign. We also heard in the press that the petroleum industry bill is a priority to get passed. So we put as PwC 5 structural challenges the last 6 months. These are two of them, the power industry and the petroleum industry bill. So if already the new group of ministers is willing to take on the structural challenges, then we could unlock a lot faster growth.
Now, which key ministers should we be watching?
Well, to just again consulting, I think so. We've seen some continuity now with the Minister of Finance, with
Yes.
Minister, and of course you said let's discuss these men, but of course Minister Ahmed. It's great to have such a powerful woman in the cabinet. She came out yesterday, reported in the press, and said that we need to raise more revenue in order to prevent a fiscal crisis. So I think that was a very good thing to say, because she's being very honest about the fiscal situation, about the fact we don't raise much revenue. I think we would challenge the government to say, and our position has been, we need to focus on the top of the pyramid in raising revenue. There's no point in trying to raise revenue from the bottom or the middle of Nigerian economic society if we're not collecting the right revenue from the top. So please, if we need to raise more revenue, start from the top, show that even the wealthy and powerful in Nigeria pay their taxes, and then it will be more credible to raise taxes all the way through. So I think that was a very good sign from Minister Ahmed. I think that we've got a new minister in industry, trade, and investment, so Minister Adebayo. He's replaced Minister Dr. Enelama, who came from the private sector, understood the private sector very well. So we really need Minister Adebayo to step up, because in order to get 6 to 8% growth, we need a lot more investment. The investment in Nigeria's what economists call growth capital formation is only 15 or 16%. We need that number 26 to 30%. So we need to almost double the investment level, both from domestic sources and from international sources. And so he needs to do everything that he can to make sure we're getting that investment to get growth. So I think he's one minister that we'll really be watching closely, Minister Adebayo at Industry, Trade, and Investment.
Okay. Now let me go back to Minister Zainab Usman, who is the Minister of Finance, and she would also be overseeing budget and national planning, as there's a Minister of State for budget and national planning there already. You did mention, of course, what she said, that we need to raise revenues. But if you take a look at some of the daunting tasks or challenges before Zainab Ahmed, very, very challenging. We're already having a weak public revenue. We're not making as much money as we should make, rising debt levels, as well as high public wage bill. How do you think that these problems can be tackled, especially for the minister right now? I guess she may have resumed work this morning. How do you think this can be tackled?
Well, I think 2 or 3 years ago, when we got asked about the debt levels, we said the debt levels were manageable if the economy grew. Unfortunately, the economy has not grown really at all and has shrunk per capita. So now we're in a much more difficult fiscal position. I mean, to begin with, and many commentators have said this, including PwC, we have, it's reported, the trillion naira fuel subsidy. So we're under immense fiscal pressure, and yet we're subsidizing fuel mainly to benefit upper middle class or upper class people to the tune of 1 trillion naira. So in the short term, that would be a good place to start. The other issue I think that all Nigerians understand, of course, is the high cost of governance. I mean, here we've got 43 ministers. As I said, most ministries have a minister and a minister for state. We also have very high governance in the National Assembly, governance costs that are widely reported by some of the watchdogs like NG Tracker and Budget, et cetera. So I think that maybe Minister Ahmed is going to have to take on some of these governance cost issues. I mean, it's been a subject that we're all aware of, but no one has taken any practical actions. But it might have come to the point where we need to do that now. I mean, when she used the word, at least reported in the press, fiscal crisis, if we hit a fiscal crisis in Nigeria, it will mean the IMF coming in and these kinds of things, they'll be forced on the country. I think that the minister needs to make clear to her colleagues and to the legislators that it would be better if Nigeria controlled its own destiny in some of these restructuring things than waiting for outsiders if we hit a true fiscal crisis.
You know, Dr. Nevin, it's really so ironic that for President Buhari in his first term, they'd say, okay, fine, he went for a very slim cabinet and perhaps he was hailed for it. But with benefit of hindsight right now, looking at the first cabinet, perhaps he did not get as much deliverables as he wanted. He now created additional ministries which will give us a higher cost of governance, because the ministers would also have their own, perhaps Minister of State and all the paraphernalia that comes with the office. Perhaps in the sense of, is it the civil service now, the public service will not be as bloated as it should be, but at the high cost of governance. Let's still stick a bit with a weak revenue that Nigeria is still getting, because if you take a look at our debt to GDP ratio is still manageable, but where we do have a problem is the debt to revenue, that's the debt servicing to revenue, which for every naira that Nigeria makes, if Nigeria makes 1 naira, Nigeria uses 66 kobo out of that 1 naira to service its debt, which is, I think, over 70%. So that is quite a very huge task at this point for a debt level that is around 24 trillion naira. Do we still have headroom to borrow? Because I'm just thinking, what would be the other policy options perhaps for Zainab Ahmed to take at this point?
Well, in terms of, I mean, you're right, the headline number, 24% debt to GDP sounds very manageable. But as you pointed out, because we collect so little revenue, more than half of our revenue, 2/3, is going to pay for the interest in Nigeria on that. And I don't think that any economist thinks this is sustainable. So what are the solutions to it? At one level, the state sector has to get bigger. So it needs to raise more revenue. But in the short term, as I said, the most obvious saving she has is the fuel subsidy. I mean, the more complex things like the cost of governance are difficult. I mean, we've seen the FIRS make a lot of efforts to raise more tax revenue in the last few years. They haven't been entirely successful. I mean, I think they've made a lot of good improvements in the FIRS. But the reason it's hard to raise more tax revenue, as I said, is one, I think Nigerians don't believe that the upper echelons of society are necessarily paying their taxes, so we need to attack that. And secondly, the economy is not growing. So the minister needs this economic growth to get out of it. She can start with the fuel subsidy as sort of low-hanging fruit to improve the fiscal situation. Of course, if she can eliminate the fuel subsidy politically and bring down the deficit, that will also bring down interest rates, which would then reduce the total amount that she needs to spend on the interest payments. So in a sense, it's a bit circular. Because we're borrowing so much, interest rates are high, and therefore 2/3 of our collected revenue in Nigeria goes to pay for just the interest. But the situation is not sustainable, and I think as I said, what's important about what the Minister Ahmed said yesterday is she's acknowledging that it's not sustainable, and she, I think, at least reported, as I said, used the word crisis. So I think that should be a wake-up call to other ministers and, of course, to the presidency. Because the Minister of Finance, one of the key roles that she has to play is to be the kind of watchdog. Every minister wants to spend more in his or her ministry. She needs to say, this is the capacity we have in the country.
Now, let's quickly take a look at the big elephant in the room, too, which is the fiscal and the monetary coordination side. Now we do have a Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning. Should we begin to see a better coordination between the fiscal authority and the central bank on the other hand, in as much as we have our central bank right now moving into a lot of the developmental role?
Well, I mean, I've watched this over the years. I mean, I came to the country more than 10 years ago and worked initially. The initial work I did in Nigeria was with the central bank. And I remember Governor Sanusi, when he was leaving, saying that he was asked this question: should the central bank be intervening with the intervention programs? At that time, they had just begun. I think this is 2013. And he said, if the central bank did not do this, no one else was there. That's why we're doing it. I was listening to another central bank official maybe a week ago, and he effectively said the same thing. The reason that the central bank is getting involved in the development issues, the intervention funds, milk, agricultural, SME lending, is because if they didn't do it, there's no other group. So I think that maybe one thing that Mr. Finance needs to think about is how to strengthen institutions outside of the CBN. So institutions like the Bank of Industry, the Bank of Agriculture, the Development Bank of Nigeria. So if they become stronger at supporting SMEs, agricultural, economic development, the central bank won't feel like it has to go in to fill that gap. And I think the central bank, one of the challenges is it's a very professional organization. I think that they've done as good a job as possible in the monetary policy side, highly technical, just given the challenges we have. But I think that it would be easier for the central bank to do things if they had less to do, because right now they're trying to do too many things. They've got the monetary policy, they have issues around banking regulation, AML, KYC, that takes a lot of time, issues around the Forex situation, intervention funds, and at the same time we have the rise of fintech, so many new technologies that affect banking and finance. So I think their agenda is too full, and if we could get the Development Bank of Nigeria, Bank of Industry, Bank of Agriculture, and the Minister of Finance really working on more on the development issues, that would probably be best for the country.
Okay, let's go back a bit to Minister Adebayo of Trade and Industry. You talked about bringing new investments into the country, but the key question right now would be, how would we rebuild investors' confidence? Because if you take a look at the last report, which came out, was it like 2 months ago, Ghana was even ahead of Nigeria in terms of foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment into Africa fell about 43%, and Nigeria got about, I think, $2.8 billion of that. Ghana was ahead, and some other African countries. Foreign investors seem not to be coming into the country, though the NIPC did say, was it 2 weeks back, that there was an investors announcement or investment announcement of $15 billion. That's investment announcement. That's intention, not reality on ground. How should investors' confidence be rebuilt amid insecurity challenges also and, lack of consistent policy by government?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right that foreign direct investment number, which was below Ghana, is very disappointing. To begin with, though, I think that even though we're trying to rotate away from petroleum or oil and gas, the biggest investment in the short term in FDI is going to still come in that sector. And there's lots of things that need to happen, certainly in terms of gas investment. And so I think the passage of the PID would actually make a big difference to it. And the investors in those areas are used to kind of difficult situations like Nigeria. At the same time, I think that we talked a little earlier about PEBEC and the fantastic work that Dr. Jamoke has done at PEBEC. I mean, we need to keep on PEBEC. I'll tell the viewers, I've had people who file complaints with PEBEC around issues around doing business in this country, and PEBEC is extremely responsive, and they're doing a fantastic job. They've got this online presence, and we need to keep the PEBEC work going that way. So I think that, and I also know, because I speak to a lot of people that want to do investment in this country, that they recognize the opportunity and they're pushing harder, but we're still making it a little bit too difficult. The last comment you made, I think, is a big concern for investors, which is the policy shifts. So we've had a history in this country, I think, in my brief history, even in the 10 years, that sometimes a governor will do something fantastic, and then at the end of his term, I'll say his because I'm not sure there are any women governors, at the end of his term, the new governor will come in and change the good things that they're doing, and it creates uncertainty for the investors. So one thing I would urge at both the state level and at the federal government level is when we change leaders, don't change the things that are working. I mean, the investment horizons for investors are 10, 15, 20, can be 25 years. So they want to see continuity of policy.
Now, let's talk about the petroleum sector a bit. There's a Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, Temipire Silva, and the President did even say yesterday, he laid emphasis on it when he called Temipire Silva as the Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, with him still as the Minister of Petroleum. What do you think should be done to reposition the sector, even as oil accounts for about 70% of Nigeria's revenue?
Well, I think that, we've said before, I mean, it is a critical sector, and of course we also have the GMD of NNPC, which in a way you may argue is a more important actor on this. But, you know, I hope the Minister of State for Petroleum has a high influence as well. But what we've said in the past is that NNPC should think about some restructuring where the regulatory role and the operator role are clarified or somewhat separated. So you know who's the regulator, and then NNPC then has its subsidiaries that operate, like NNLG. And then what we would like the country to consider is that, again, taking NNLG, is can we take some of the key subsidiaries of NNPC and partially list them on the Nigerian Stock Exchange. Now, what would that do? It would do maybe three different things. One is, because it would be listed on the stock exchange, and we're talking about selling 20, 30% to the public, but it would give Nigerians a chance to invest directly into their own assets. It would still leave it under government control because it would be only a minority, but it would then subject the company to the kind of disclosure and clarity that come from a stock exchange listing. So then that would really help in the governance of those entities. Because I think one thing that all Nigerians worry about is the opacity of the NNPC. So we know how much is transferred from the NNPC to the federal government for the allocation, federal allocation, but we don't know necessarily all the pieces that go in. It's very complex because you might look at oil price and oil production and say, therefore, this much money should come to the government, but it depends on joint venture arrangements, you know, cash calls, we've had issues in the past, production sharing, you know, what needs to be invested to keep the production flowing. So it's not a simple equation. So if we can bring more clarity to NNPC finances for the country through a few structural changes and perhaps a partial listings, we think that would be very beneficial.
Now let's take a look at the governance culture in Nigeria. At least since, or perhaps this administration, you see that even the president said it himself, that he wants to work with those that he trusts. So we believe that perhaps the 43 ministers are those that he has chosen to work with him the second term are his trusted allies. And perhaps a balance in a political balance in there. How do you even see, let's delve a bit to political culture in Nigeria and how it is also impacting on governance and perhaps some of the results and the outputs that we're seeing even regarding the economy. How do you juxtapose all of that?
Well, it's difficult as an outsider for me to really comment. What I will say is, and I've actually had this conversation with the member of one state government that was very, very successful, who made the point to me that actually a small group of people, 8 to 10 people pulling in the same direction, can make a huge difference. So I suspect that if this administration is going to be successful, it's not going to be 43 ministers working in tangent. It's going to be 8, 10, maybe 15 at the most, that kind of emerge key portfolios, leadership who really lead, that really drive the change, with the other ministers supporting and not, hopefully, supporting that kind of change. So if we see this emergence, and particularly at the Federal Executive Council level, where they debate the economic matters, if we can see this core group of people that really want to see the private sector develop, that really want to see people lifted out of poverty, who really want to see unemployment, then hopefully they'll drive the kind of changes that will do that. The other thing that we have talked about a lot for the last 2 years or so is that a big part of what needs to happen happens at the state level. So one of the things that I think it should be on the agenda of the federal government is, how do their actions create room for states to develop their own economies? And if we look around the country, I mean, I'm sure there are many more, but the particular governors that I see that are really pushing hard to develop their own states, Governor Obaseki in Edo State, I think Governor Makinda, who's new, is pushing very hard in Oyo State. Governor Fayemi in Ekiti State are being 3 examples where the governor is making a big difference. So how can this group of ministers at the federal level support the governors that are making a difference and highlight the governors that are making a difference? And let's hope through the democratic process we get more governors that are really the right people to be running their states. And so if we get this coordination between giving the states some control over the local economy and the federal government supporting that and doing the right policies there, then we could achieve the double-digit growth that the Central Bank of Nigeria governor wants us to get to.
Should there be a kind of marking scheme for these ministers moving ahead? That's the terms of, or let's put it this way, a kind of performance, indicator for the ministers set by the president himself. Should the president, should he still be transfixed with that composure of, okay, because I've appointed you to that position, even if there's something hanging over your head and the public is crying, oh, take him out or take her out, he or she still stays there. Should there be a kind of performance indicator moving forward? Because this administration has less than 4 years, that the public would even know, or that the public would even be markers of that scheme.
Well, I think that, I mean, the president's chosen who's chosen, it's done. I mean, I think if the country is serious about certainly the economic goals with the poverty and the unemployment alleviation, the president should set out for each minister some goals. I think the concern sometimes when you do this is that you have too many goals. So I think what would be the most useful is if the president said 2 or 3 goals. So if we're talking about the power sector, we need to get to 20 gigawatts or whatever the number is over the next few years. And if the minister's not getting there, we take action at that point in time. But let's not make 15 goals for the minister. I think where the country is at, you need 2 or 3 goals. What is interesting, and of course each ministry is different. So in a way you have to set different goals. But what's interesting about what you say is one thing that we're thinking about at PwC is how do we create a scorecard for states? Because, of course, states, you can have, in a way, a comparison. What's this governor done to help alleviate poverty? What's this governor done in education, health? So perhaps we can create a scorecard also for states that really highlights the states, and the states become a little bit competitive.
Okay, I have 2 questions, then we'll end the program. The ERGP, Economic and Growth, Recovery and Growth Plan, should we now see like it being back on steam or perhaps higher steam with the ministers on ground now?
Well, I think that the ERGP, and I've read the whole thing, the entire document, I think the issue with the ERGP is every individual piece of it made a lot of sense, but it was too complex, too many things going on. As I said, I think that what the president's done in the last few days, or since June 12th, I think, when he made the announcement, is in a way we've simplified the economic challenge. So the economic challenge is lifting 100 million people out of poverty, growing at 6, 8, 10%, alleviating unemployment. And I think we need to stay more focused on that, just on those numbers. And then that translates into some issues in infrastructure, power, PIB that we know. And of course, when we put out our list of structural issues, we didn't put out 20 at PwC, we only put out 5. So I think from our viewpoint, we'd like to see a simplification, focus on a few key things so that we make sure that we accomplish them. So in that sense, I think a lot of the ERGP may not be actually implemented. Though I will highlight one issue that never got discussed. So very deep in the ERGP, the question got raised about the population growth in Nigeria and
Yes.
whether we should be having policies to think about it. So I think that should come up, and we never heard about it again.
Yeah.
So see if we can put that issue back on the agenda, because it does put enormous pressure on everything: education, health, infrastructure, when we're growing at 2.7% population growth.
Well, the question is also we should even know how many we are. So perhaps there's a need for a census. Do you support that? Head count.
Well, yesterday the former president came out and raised this
President
this
Obasanjo.
issue.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think if the former president, with his stature, comes out and says this is an issue, I think that the politicians, the federal government, should take it seriously. We didn't have a census in 2016. Some people questioned the numbers in 2006. So I think it does make sense. And certainly we have the example of India that's done an exceptional job of enumerating almost all of its people in the country. So I was very happy to see the former president come out and put that on the agenda, because people have been reluctant to address that.
Okay. Okay, Dr. Nevin, finally, your tweet on the 12th of August, and you did say, let me read it. Can we quickly put it on the screen? I have not been very active on Twitter this week, but thought this quote worth sharing: to applaud a politician because he or she has built a hospital, a school, a road with public money is applauding, and it is like applauding an ATM because it gives you money in just 30 seconds. What's that about? You're bringing us to the consciousness that the politicians are there to serve us.
I mean, it wasn't my quote, but someone sent it to me. I thought it was a fantastic quote. I mean, public servants come to work and they do their job, and we don't necessarily need to celebrate if they do their job properly. That's what they're expected to do. And in the private sector, people come millions of people in Lagos come every day and they do their job. And yeah, I mean, sometimes we celebrate, but we should also expect the public service, like private sector, to simply do its job. So if someone delivers a road that's paid for by the public, we don't necessarily need to applaud it. We just need to say, you've done your job.
Well
now let's
done.
move on to the
next. Yes, you've done your job. Go to the next thing. Thank you very much, Dr. Nevin. Nice speaking with you again today. I wish you a lovely day.
Thank you, Nancy. It was wonderful to speak with you.
All right. Thank you. I've been speaking with Dr. Andrew Nevin.